We obviously live in a globalized world, undeniably, and we've got more access to information than we ever have before. And with that comes opportunity, especially for young people, and we see that everywhere in the world. I think it's quite safe to say that we now have the most involved and active and informed generation. Young people today are involved in a web of projects, from volunteering to conferences and trainings and workshops to full-on political movements everywhere. We can see it through the wonder that is social media, and the very event that we're at today is proof of that, of what young people, determined and passionate, can do when they're trying to make a change. And I myself am quite guilty of this. I've jumped at every opportunity that I got to take on any project that sounded good, that I've seen on Facebook, on LinkedIn, that I've got emails about. And I've traveled across Europe to do this. And I think I've learned quite a lot. Well, I like to think that I've learned quite a lot from the projects that I've engaged in. And I've had a fair bit of fun doing it as well. But attending all of these events, I've also got to listen to a lot of speeches. And I've noticed that a lot of them go on to similar lines. There's always a bit with the thank yous at the end, and it includes humble remarks about gratitude. And I think that's great because it's so important that we stay grounded and we remember to be grateful for the opportunities that we get. But after that bit, there's always a section that tends to tie in to how special we are, how incredible our achievements are so far, and how great we are to have gotten that far in the first place. And obviously, that is beautiful, because it's important for us to remember that we're amazing to get there, that our achievements are important. Self-love is key to happiness for everyone. And it's great that we're encouraging people to see themselves in a positive light, to build on that, and to always be grateful. But I think there's also a flip side to that story that we don't often think about. I think this kind of rhetoric can lead to us feeling somehow entitled to those opportunities that we get in the first place. You see, this kind of rhetoric that I don't often remember, the inspiring praise about where we've gotten, is not exactly the bit that we should be always focusing on, because we see it everywhere now around us. It's a trend. We see it in advertising and branding. We see it in the multitude of books that are published about to discover how we're amazing, our inner goddess and all that. It's everywhere around us. And I think it's important to think about how that can lead to inflating our sense of entitlement. And while I gotta admit, I don't remember much of this inspirational praise that I've listened to along the years, I do remember this one speech very, very clearly. And it was at a similar conference in Georgia. This girl, Sophie, came up to the stage. She was presiding the event. And the room froze, just froze, when she came up and said, "Actually, we're not that special." And you see, everybody just waited for a follow-up or some sort of joke, thought they misheard, were just waiting for the point. But that really struck a chord with me, because she went on and she said, "Actually, we have to think about this fact that anyone that would have been born in the same countries and with the same families and raised under the same circumstances that we have would have probably turned out just the same. Obviously, we have to be proud of the way that we use those opportunities to grow and to learn, but we have to always remember that it's a matter of luck that we got them in the first place." See, we often tend to forget that bit of the story, and that's why I sort of cringe all the time when I hear these remarks in the media that are circulated now, especially with regards to the refugee crisis and to migration. It's always things like, they're coming to take our countries, our cities, our streets. And to me, that sounds odd. See, while I understand how proud we must be of where we come from, the fact that we can use that sort of rhetoric to exclude others or to claim land as ours, as something that we're entitled to by some birthright, that's ridiculous to me. Because actually, what have we done to make it our country in the first place, to deserve it being our country? Of course, you probably pay taxes to be a citizen of that country, and maybe your parents or your grandparents have done the same. But what's to say that anyone else, born under the same circumstances, in the same families, in the same countries, wouldn't have done exactly the same? See, that's what I don't understand. I'm sorry, my slideshow is getting ahead of myself, and I'm not sure. Yeah, sorry. So I think it's very difficult to obviously see this kind of rhetoric and identify it. But it is sad that we often forget that we're here purely by luck. And we do often forget that borders aren't natural things. They aren't inherently real. They're artificial concepts. They're constructed. That's why they change over time. That's why they're so contested in many parts of the world. They're just made-up concepts, made for administrative purposes. They're not inherently part of us, you see? And they're shaped as such for political reasons. Nationalism and this sense of entitlement is a similar tool. It came up, it emerged, because people had the desire to govern societies in the same way that borders were needed in order to govern societies. And simple borders and somebody's desire to gain power isn't enough to motivate people to support them, to fight wars for them. You need a strong sense of shared identity and even a perceived threat to get people motivated enough to do that. So that's how borders and nationalism and this narrative of us against them came up, because it's so much easier for anyone to rally people against a common enemy in order to achieve their goals than to just do it out of thin air or to make them do it for somebody's political ambitions. And I think that's how we end up with these kind of narratives of us against them, and we get caught up in them, and we see everywhere around us, this is a political tool that's been used forever, and it's still being used now. And we end up with the rise of far-right, with xenophobia in a globalized world, and we end up with people like Donald Trump. See, obviously, the problems, well, some of the problems that people like Donald Trump bring up are real. There are very real, dangerous consequences of things like migration and like the refugee crisis, logistics and economic problems. But the fact that we think that policies like Donald Trump's of building walls are actually efficient in dealing with the problems in the first place is completely ludicrous. See, what we're seeing now is just the monstrous effects of these constructed concepts. Because we see the plight of refugees, the suffering of people in war, plastered across the media. And instead of having the human reaction to help, we come up with this reaction that comes from this narrative of us against them, out of this sense of self-entitlement, and we think it's okay to build walls. And somehow, some of us are persuaded that that will solve the problem. Because it is a political vehicle. It's much easier for a politician to rally people against a constructed enemy than to tell the story of how the economic crisis actually works, to explain the intricacies of problems like that. Because who has the time to wait for this story, the background knowledge to understand it? And let's be honest, it's not as scandalous a story. It's not as good a political slogan. So it's much easier to just shift the blame than to explain what's actually happening, the causes of the problems, the difficulty of achieving real solutions, and maybe even accepting the blame of the population, of the government, of sections of the population. So why not shift it to a perceived easier solution, blaming a minority, an immigrant, something seen as foreign, and just getting away with that? That seems much easier for everyone. And we do get caught up in this. But it's very easy to get caught up in it. What can we actually do to get away from it? Because we see these policies, and what are they going to do in a globalized world? See, I think the first step that we need to take is to accept the fact that globalization is happening, and that there's very little that we can do to reverse it. I don't think at this point we can kind of swim against the flow and just decide that we can build walls. All that's going to do is simply create more conflict, more division, alienate and marginalize people, radicalize people, and reap the seeds for conflict, long-lasting, for decades to come. What we need to do, this is why this is my favorite quote, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. It will take an active, conscious effort on our behalves to filter discrimination and prejudice out of everything that we're exposed to. It's not something that can be done passively. It's not enough to be aware that we haven't done anything to deserve being here, or that these narratives are political tools, because that just gets us trapped in a vicious circle that gets us nowhere. We need to make an active, conscious effort all the time to eliminate this kind of narrative and prejudice and discrimination from everything that we hear, that we say, combat it in every single aspect that we see it in, and combat the us against them narrative everywhere, because it is artificially constructed. It is counterproductive. And there's no other way but an active filter everywhere from all of us. I think, again, in an increasingly globalized world, we need to always be aware that local or national solutions, especially isolationist ones or protectionist ones, are just no longer enough to address the actual causes of the problems. And we have to look beyond that, beyond these kind of easy fixes that have done nothing in the past to solve the conflicts and are just making everything worse. And we need to focus on cooperation. For that, we need to change mindsets and to filter everything constantly, not to build walls, not to get caught up in this again and again, because that won't solve anything. So in order for that, this is where the opportunities that we have come in. We've got so many of them, and I know that obviously it is very tempting to use them for our CVs, for our careers, and that's great, obviously. There's so many problems in the world, and we can't all be expected to be activists or to solve everything, to balance all the inequalities. But what we can do is bring this mindset, this new mindset, in every aspect of our lives and promote it as much as we can. Choose something that we're passionate about and go for it. Just go for it and focus on learning something from it and on real growth. That's the only key way that we can actually progress from this and foster cooperation. If we're passionate about something and we use every opportunity that we get to build bridges, to combat these artificial divisions, to overcome them, and to change the mindsets of ourselves, to educate ourselves and the people around us, then we have an actual chance of changing the narrative in the long run and of creating a generation that's much less vulnerable to such divisive rhetoric and that can focus on the actual solutions, on finding real, sustainable solutions for everybody that will work in the real world and that will solve the problems that lead us in this crisis in the first place. So I think what we need to do is to always remember that we have to be proud of all of our achievements, of where we come from, of where what we've grown, how we've grown, but never allow ourselves to feel entitled to it. Just remember that it's not a right, an inherent right. It's a privilege that we were given. And just don't allow other people to use that privilege, that luck, that achievement to divide, to create division and tension, to drive wedges between sections of society. But make the most out of all the opportunities that we get, to grow, to educate the people around us, to change our mindset and the mindset of the people around us, and to actually grow so that we can stop getting caught up in this narrow-scoped power games and that we can actually focus on finding real solutions. Because in an interconnected, globalized world, that's the only real way for progress, in my opinion. Thank you.